The early morning sunlight streamed through the massive windows of Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors as passengers hurried to their gates. Among them walked David Johnson, a man whose presence carried the quiet confidence that comes from spending thousands of hours in the cockpit of commercial airliners. Today, though, he wasn't in his usual pilot's uniform. Instead, he wore comfortable jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and a well-worn leather jacket, his vacation clothes. After spending a refreshing week with his family in Atlanta, David was heading to New York for his next flight assignment. His carry-on bag contained his neatly folded uniform and pilot credentials, but he didn't feel a need to announce his profession to everyone he passed. 15 years of flying had taught him to appreciate these moments of anonymity, of being just another traveler in the bustling crowd. As he walked through the terminal, David couldn't help but smile at the familiar sights and sounds that had become like a second home to him. The aroma of fresh coffee wafted from nearby cafes, mixing with the excited chatter of families heading off on adventures and the rhythmic announcements echoing through the speakers. He passed by the large windows overlooking the runways, where massive aircraft took off and landed with clockwork precision. Each plane that soared into the sky reminded him of his own journey, from the wide-eyed kid who dreamed of flying to the accomplished pilot he'd become. David checked his watch. He was right on schedule, just as he liked to be. His first-class ticket was safely tucked in his phone case, a perk of his job that he'd earned through years of dedicated service. As he approached his gate, he noticed the growing crowd of passengers already forming lines, some clutching their coffee cups, while others were absorbed in their phones or books. The morning light caught the silver wings pin he always kept on his jacket's lapel, a small reminder of his achievements that most people wouldn't even notice. It was a gift from his father on the day he earned his pilot's license, and he wore it everywhere, even when traveling as a passenger. To anyone else, it might have looked like just another piece of jewelry, but to David, it represented everything he'd overcome to reach his dreams. He joined the line of waiting passengers, pulling out his phone to send a quick message to his wife. At the gate, he typed, "New York bound." Her reply came almost instantly, "Fly safe, even if someone else is driving today." It was their little inside joke, one that always made him grin. David settled into one of the uncomfortable airport chairs, watching as more passengers filtered into the waiting area. A young boy nearby pressed his face against the window, pointing excitedly at each plane that taxied past. David remembered being that child, feeling that same pure wonder at the miracle of flight. He thought about going over to tell the boy about what it's like up there in the cockpit, but decided to keep that secret to himself for now. Sometimes the best stories reveal themselves at their own pace. The gate area continued to fill up as departure time approached. Business travelers in pressed suits tapped away at laptops, families corralled excited children, and flight crews in crisp uniforms strode purposefully through the terminal. David observed it all with the practiced eye of someone who had seen countless similar scenes play out. Yet something about today felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Perhaps it was just the unusual experience of being on this side of the journey, a pilot becoming a passenger. Little did he know that this routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary, and that his next few hours would test not just his patience, but his ability to transform an ugly moment into something meaningful. The boarding call finally came over the speakers, and David stood up, gathering his carry-on bag. He had done this hundreds of times before, but today he was just another passenger in the crowd. As a frequent flyer, he knew the drill. First-class passengers would board first, followed by those needing special assistance, and then everyone else by group number. "Now boarding our first-class passengers," the gate agent announced cheerfully through the microphone. David stepped forward, phone in hand with his digital boarding pass ready. He could feel the gentle weight of his pilot's uniform in his bag, but there was no reason to mention it. Today, he was simply looking forward to enjoying the comfortable seat he earned through his years of service. As he approached the boarding gate, A flight attendant with perfectly styled hair and a crisp blue uniform stepped in front of him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice carrying a hint of suspicion that made several nearby passengers turn their heads. "This line is for first-class boarding only." David smiled politely, holding up his phone to show his boarding pass. "Yes, I know. I'm in seat 2A. He kept his voice steady and professional, just as he did during his pre-flight announcements in the cockpit. The flight attendant frowned, looking from the boarding pass to David, then back again. "There must be some mistake," she said, loud enough for others to hear. "Could you step aside while I verify this?" Around them, the terminal had grown oddly quiet. A businessman in an expensive suit pretended to be deeply interested in his phone. A mother pulled her curious children closer, whispering something to them. David could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. "There's no mistake," David explained calmly, though he could feel his heart beating a little faster. "I fly this route regularly. The ticket is correct." He thought about the hundreds of flights he piloted, the thousands of passengers he'd safely carried through the skies. Yet here he stood, being questioned about his right to sit in first class. The flight attendant's supervisor appeared, a clipboard in hand. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, glancing between David and the flight attendant. More passengers were watching now, some with uncomfortable expressions, others with something that looked like recognition in their eyes. Recognition of a scene they'd seen play out too many times before. "This gentleman is trying to board in first class," the flight attendant explained, as if David wasn't standing right there. "I'm just making sure everything is in order." The way she said "gentleman" made it sound like anything but a courtesy. David took a deep breath, remembering the words his father had taught him years ago. "Your dignity is not determined by how others treat you, but by how you respond." He remained composed, though he could feel a familiar sting of assumptions and prejudice that no amount of professional success seemed to shield him from. Other first-class passengers were boarding now, walking past the scene with sideways glances. Some looked embarrassed, others curious, as David stood there, still being questioned about a ticket he had every right to hold. A young woman in a business suit caught his eye and gave him a small, apologetic smile, the kind that acknowledged the unfairness of the situation without knowing how to help. The supervisor was now scrutinizing his boarding pass with exaggerated attention, tapping away at her tablet as if the truth of his ticket might be hidden in some digital footnote. David adjusted the strap of his bag on his shoulder, feeling the weight of his pilot's uniform inside. He hadn't planned on revealing his profession today, preferring to travel quietly like any other passenger. But sometimes life has other plans. The tension in the air was building, and David knew this moment could go one of two ways. He could let anger take over, or he could turn this into something more meaningful. As he reached for his bag, he knew exactly what he needed to do, not just for himself, but for everyone watching this scene unfold. The airport terminal's bright lights seemed to grow harsher as David stood there, still being questioned about his first-class ticket. Around him, the murmur of other passengers grew, some whispering to each other, others shifting uncomfortably as they watched the scene unfold. The supervisor's fingers tapped rapidly on her tablet, the sound mixing with the overhead announcements and distant jet engines. "Sir," the supervisor said, her voice carrying that special kind of forced politeness, "there seems to be some confusion with your ticket. Perhaps you were upgraded accidentally?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We can help you find a seat in economy class." David felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach. He'd faced moments like this before, at restaurants, in stores, even in the pilot's lounge when wearing casual clothes. Each time, it chipped away at something inside, even though he'd grown used to it over the years. The difference was, today there were dozens of witnesses to this small act of prejudice, all pretending not to watch while seeing everything. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, tugged at her father's sleeve and asked in that loud, clear voice that only children have, "Dad, Why is that man being stopped? Her father quickly shushed her, face reddening as he tried to look anywhere but at David. The line behind David had grown longer, passengers shuffling and checking their watches. Some looked annoyed at the delay, while others seemed deeply uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. David could hear fragments of whispered conversations. This isn't right. Should someone say something? It's 2024, and still. I've been a frequent flyer with this airline for years, David explained, keeping his voice level despite the humiliation burning in his chest. My ticket is valid. I earned this seat. He thought about all the nights he'd spent away from his family, all the holidays he'd missed, all the storms he'd navigated through, not just in the sky, but in moments exactly like this one. The flight attendant who'd first stopped him was now avoiding eye contact, suddenly very interested in arranging boarding passes on her podium. But the supervisor pressed on, her voice taking on an edge of authority. Sir, if you could just step aside, we need to verify some things. We have other passengers waiting to board. A businessman in an expensive suit walked past, flashing his first-class ticket. The same flight attendant who'd stopped David smiled brightly and waved him through without a second glance. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone watching. David felt the weight of his pilot's uniform in his bag, pressed and ready for tomorrow's flight. He hadn't wanted to use it like this. Hadn't wanted to have to prove himself worthy of a seat he'd rightfully purchased. But sometimes, dignity means standing your ground, even when others try to push you aside. An elderly woman in the line spoke up, her voice shaking slightly but clear. This is ridiculous. Let the man board. A few others nodded in agreement, but most stayed silent, caught in that uncomfortable space between wanting to help and not wanting to get involved. The supervisor's face hardened at this interruption. Ma'am, we have procedures we need to follow. She turned back to David. Sir, if you can't verify how you obtained this ticket, we'll have to. David cut her off, not with anger, but with the same calm authority he used when addressing his flight crew. Would you like to see my other credentials as well? His hand moved toward his bag, where his pilot's uniform and ID waited like a shield he wished he didn't need. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch. Other passengers had stopped pretending not to watch, their eyes fixed on this scene that was sadly too familiar to some and eye-opening to others. In this moment, suspended between humiliation and vindication, David knew his next action would ripple far beyond this gate, this flight, this day. With steady hands that had guided massive aircraft through stormy skies, David slowly unzipped his carry-on bag. The quiet rustling seemed to echo through the terminal as nearby passengers leaned forward, curious about what would happen next. He reached inside and first pulled out his pilot's uniform, crisp and clean, the golden wings on the jacket catching the terminal's fluorescent light. I was trying to enjoy traveling as a regular passenger today, David said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years of similar experiences. But maybe you need to see this. He pulled out his pilot's identification card and airline credentials, holding them alongside his first-class ticket. The change in the supervisor's face was immediate, like clouds parting after a storm. Her eyes widened, darting between the uniform, the credentials, and David's face. The flight attendant who had first stopped him took a small step backward, her hand rising to cover her mouth. You're one of our senior pilots, the supervisor stammered, her authoritative tone vanishing like smoke in the wind. The color drained from her face as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. Around them, passengers who had been pretending not to watch were now openly staring, some shaking their heads, others nodding in understanding. A small voice piped up from the crowd, the same young girl from earlier. He's a pilot. That's so cool. Her pure, uncomplicated reaction cut through the tension like a ray of sunshine through storm clouds. A few people couldn't help but smile, even the heaviness of the moment. David carefully folded his uniform back into his bag. I've flown this same route dozens of times, he said, his voice steady and professional. Sometimes in that uniform, sometimes in these casual clothes. The only difference is how I'm treated when I'm wearing each one. The terminal had grown unusually quiet, save for the distant sound of jet engines and airport announcements. Even the passengers who had been impatiently checking their watches were now fully engaged in the scene unfolding before them. Some had pulled out their phones, but a quick glance from David made them think twice about recording the moment. The supervisor struggled to find words, clutching her tablet like a shield. I sincerely apologized, Captain. This should never have happened. The title Captain now fell from her lips with respect, though it had been the same person standing before her all along. An older gentleman in the line spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. Son, I've been flying for 40 years, and I've seen too many scenes like this. But the way you handled it. He trailed off, nodding with respect. David straightened his shoulders, adjusted his jacket, and spoke in the same calm, authoritative voice he used when addressing passengers from the cockpit. The best response to moments like these isn't anger, he said, looking directly at the supervisor and flight attendant. It's education. Tomorrow, I'll be flying a plane just like the one we're about to board. Today, I'm simply a passenger who would like to take his assigned seat. The impact of his words rippled through the crowd. Some passengers applauded softly. Others stood in thoughtful silence. The supervisor, still visibly shaken, quickly processed his boarding pass, her hands trembling slightly as she scanned it. As David walked down the jet bridge, he could hear the conversation starting behind him. Quiet discussions about assumptions, about dignity, about change. He hadn't wanted to reveal his profession, hadn't wanted to have to prove himself worthy of a seat he'd rightfully purchased. But sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from the most uncomfortable moments. As David settled into his first-class seat, he could feel the eyes of other passengers on him. Not with the earlier suspicion, but with a different kind of attention now. The supervisor who had questioned him moments ago stood at the front of the cabin, her face still flushed with embarrassment. She kept glancing his way, clearly struggling with what to say or do next. Instead of ignoring her or showing anger, David caught her eye and gestured for her to come over. She hesitated for a moment, then walked to his seat, her steps uncertain. Captain, I can't begin to tell you how sorry I... Please, David interrupted gently, have a seat for a moment. He gestured to the empty seat beside him, as other passengers were still boarding. The supervisor glanced around nervously, but sat down. I've been flying planes for 15 years, David began, his voice low and calm. I've navigated through storms, handled emergency situations, and kept thousands of passengers safe. But you know what's sometimes harder than all of that? Days like today, when I'm not in my uniform. The supervisor's eyes began to well up with tears. We shouldn't have assumed. I shouldn't have. Let's turn this into a learning moment, David said, leaning forward slightly. Tell me, what made you question my ticket? His tone wasn't accusatory, but genuinely curious, creating a space for honest conversation. Other passengers passing by slowed their pace, trying to catch bits of the conversation. The flight attendant who had first stopped David at the gate joined them, standing in the aisle with her hands clasped tightly together. I don't know, the supervisor admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It was automatic. I didn't even think. I just reacted. She paused, the realization of her actions sinking in deeper. I've never had to face my own biases like this before. David nodded thoughtfully. Those automatic reactions, they're what we all need to examine. Every time I step into an airport wearing casual clothes, I know there's a chance something like this might happen. But instead of letting it make me bitter, I choose to make it a teaching opportunity. A couple seated across the aisle had stopped their conversation to listen. The wife dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while her husband stared straight ahead, clearly moved but trying to maintain his composure. You know what makes a good pilot? David continued, speaking not just to the supervisor now, but to everyone within earshot. It's not just about flying the plane. It's about staying calm under pressure, making good decisions, and most importantly, learning from our mistakes. The same applies to how we treat each other on the ground. The flight attendant spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. I've been in aviation for 12 years, and this has made me realize. She struggled to find the right words. That's exactly it, David said warmly. Realizing. Recognizing. That's where change begins. Tomorrow, I'll be back in my uniform, commanding a flight just like this one. Some of you might even be my passengers. But today, I'm just a person who wanted to get home, just like everyone else on this plane. The supervisor wiped her eyes and stood up, straightening her uniform. Thank you, she said, her voice stronger now. For teaching instead of condemning. We'll do better. As she walked away, David noticed the young girl from the gate watching him with wide, curious eyes. He smiled and gave her a small wave. Her face lit up with pure joy, untouched by the prejudices that adults too often carry. In that moment, he felt hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the next generation would see people for who they are, not what they're wearing or how they look. As the plane reached cruising altitude, word of what had happened at the gate spread through the cabin like ripples in a pond. Passengers whispered to each other, sharing what they'd witnessed. Some had been there from the beginning, while others were just hearing about it. The story seemed to touch something deep in everyone who heard it. The first-class cabin felt different than usual. Instead of passengers keeping to themselves behind newspapers or laptops, there was a sense of community, of shared experience. A businessman who had witnessed everything at the gate caught David's eye and raised his coffee cup in a silent gesture of respect. "Excuse me," a soft voice said. David looked up to see an elderly woman standing in the aisle. Her eyes were kind, and her hands trembled slightly as she held onto the seat for balance. "I was in line behind you at the gate. I want to tell you about something that happened to my grandson last month." David gestured to the empty seat next to him, and the woman sat down carefully. She told him about her grandson, a young doctor who had faced similar prejudice at a hospital where he worked. "The way you handled yourself," she said, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I'm going to tell him this story. He needs to hear it." More passengers began sharing their own stories. A teacher from row 3 spoke about her experiences in a predominantly white school. A businessman talked about the changes he was trying to make in his company's hiring practices. The cabin became a space for honest conversation, the kind that rarely happens between strangers. The flight attendant who had first questioned David's ticket was now serving drinks, her hands shaking slightly every time she passed his row. When she finally worked up the courage to serve him, David smiled warmly. "Could I have an apple juice, please?" he asked, as if nothing had happened. Her relief was visible. "Of course, sir. Captain," she stumbled, then paused. "My brother? He always wanted to be a pilot, but he gave up because he thought—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "Give him my card," David said, pulling out his business card. "Tell him it's never too late to follow his dreams." The flight attendant's eyes welled up with tears as she took the card, clutching it like a precious gift. The young girl who had spoken up at the gate appeared beside David's seat, her parents watching nervously from a few rows back. "Is it hard to fly a plane?" she asked, her curiosity untainted by the morning's events. David's face lit up. "Would you like to hear about what it's like in the cockpit?" The girl nodded eagerly, and soon a small group of children had gathered around, sitting cross-legged in the aisle as David explained how planes stay in the air, using his hands to demonstrate banking and turning. Their parents watched, some taking photos, others wiping away tears. In that moment, the cabin wasn't divided by class sections or prejudices. It was united by the simple joy of a pilot sharing his love of flight with the next generation. An older pilot in civilian clothes, who had been quietly observing everything, finally spoke up. "I've been flying for 30 years, he said, his voice gruff with emotion. and I've never seen anything quite like this. You've turned an ugly moment into something beautiful." The supervisor, who had been keeping a respectful distance, approached again. She had been thinking deeply about the morning's events. "Captain," she said, "would you be willing to speak at our next staff training? Your story. It needs to be heard by everyone in our company." As the plane continued its journey through the clouds, the cabin had become more than just a space between destinations. It had become a place of learning, of sharing, of healing. David looked out the window at the endless blue sky, reflecting on how a moment of prejudice had transformed into an opportunity for change. The flight had entered its second hour, and the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed into something remarkable. What had started as a tense confrontation at the gate had blossomed into meaningful conversations throughout the plane. David found himself sharing stories from his 15 years in the cockpit, but more importantly, listening to the stories of others. A middle-aged man in a business suit leaned across the aisle. "You know," he said thoughtfully, stirring his coffee, "I run a big company, and I've never thought about how our hiring process might be affected by these unconscious biases. Watching what happened today, it's opened my eyes." David nodded, understanding the weight of this realization. "Sometimes we don't see these things until they're right in front of us," he replied. "In the cockpit, we have strict checklists for everything. Maybe we need similar checks in how we treat each other on the ground." The conversation drew in a young woman sitting nearby, who turned out to be a high school counselor. "My students would love to hear your story," she said earnestly. "Especially the ones who feel like their dreams are out of reach because of how society sees them." As they talked, David shared memories of his own journey, the obstacles he'd faced, the people who'd supported him, and those who doubted him. He told them about his first solo flight, the pride in his parents' eyes when he earned his wings, and the responsibility he felt every time he stepped into the cockpit. "The sky doesn't care what you look like," he explained, gesturing to the clouds outside. "Up there, it's all about skill, knowledge, and judgment. That's how it should be everywhere." The flight attendant, who had earlier taken his business card for her brother, returned. "Captain," she said softly, "I just got a text from my brother. I told him what happened and sent him a photo of your card. He's crying. He's going to apply to flight school next week." David smiled warmly. "Tell him to reach out to me directly. I'll help him navigate the journey." Several passengers nearby wiped away tears, moved by this simple act of mentorship. A retired teacher spoke up from across the aisle. "I taught for 40 years, she said, her voice rich with experience. "And the hardest lesson was always teaching children to look past their preconceptions. But you've done it so beautifully today, without a single harsh word." The small girl who had been fascinated by his pilot stories earlier came back, this time with a drawing she'd made on her airplane napkin. It showed an airplane with a stick figure in the cockpit, wearing a huge smile. "This is you," she said proudly, handing it to David. "Making everyone happy in the sky." David carefully folded the drawing and put it in his jacket pocket, right next to his pilot's wings. "This," he said, touching the pocket, "is why we keep pushing forward. For the next generation." A mother nursing her baby spoke up quietly. "My son is 6 months old," she said, looking down at her child. "I hope by the time he grows up, he'll live in a world where people aren't judged by how they look, but by who they are." The conversations continued to flow naturally, touching on hopes, fears, and dreams. People shared stories about their own experiences with prejudice, their efforts to be better, and their visions for the future. The cabin had become a safe space for honest dialogue, where strangers felt comfortable sharing their truths. As the plane began its initial descent, David realized that this flight had become about much more than getting from one city to another. It had become a lesson in humanity, in grace under pressure, and in the power of turning difficult moments into opportunities for growth. The plane had started its descent into New York when the flight attendant who had first stopped David at the gate appeared again. This time, her eyes were red and puffy, and she carried herself differently. Gone was the defensive posture from earlier. She hesitated by his seat, gathering her courage. "May I speak with you for a moment?" she asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. The other passengers nearby quieted their conversations, sensing the importance of this moment. David gestured to the empty seat beside him, and she sat down, smoothing her uniform skirt with shaking hands. For a few moments, she just sat there, struggling to find the right words. "I've been doing this job for 8 years," she finally began, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I've never, I always thought I treated everyone equally. But today," she paused, taking a deep breath. "Today showed me I was wrong." David listened quietly, giving her the space to continue. Around them, the cabin was unusually silent, save for the gentle hum of the engines. "When I saw you at the gate," she continued, "I didn't even think. I just acted, and that's what scares me the most. I didn't even realize I was making assumptions until you showed us your pilot's uniform." Tears began rolling down her cheeks. "I keep thinking about how many other times I might have done this without even knowing it." A tissue appeared from across the aisle, offered by the elderly woman who had shared her grandson's story earlier. The flight attendant took it with a grateful nod. "You know what's remarkable?" David said gently. "It's not that you made a mistake. We all make mistakes. What's remarkable is that you're willing to face it, acknowledge it, and learn from it. That's how real change happens." She looked up at him, surprise crossing her tear-stained face. "You're being so kind about this. I don't deserve it." "This isn't about what anyone deserves," David replied. "It's about how we help each other grow. When I started flying, there weren't many pilots who looked like me. The only way that changes is if we have conversations like this one." The businessman who had been listening nearby spoke up. "I had to write down what you just said," he admitted, showing his phone where he'd been taking notes. "My company needs to hear this." The flight attendant wiped her eyes and sat up straighter. "I want to do better," she said firmly. "I want to make sure no one else feels the way I made you feel today. Would you be willing to help us create a training program? Share your story with other crew members." David smiled warmly. "I'd be honored. But remember, this isn't just about aviation. It's about how we see each other everywhere, in every situation." Another flight attendant appeared in the aisle. "We're about to land," she said softly, not wanting to interrupt but bound by duty. The first flight attendant stood up, but before she left, she turned to David one last time. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. "Not just for forgiving me, but for teaching me. I'll never forget this flight." As she walked away, several passengers reached out to squeeze her arm or pat her shoulder. Small gestures of support for someone brave enough to face her own biases and commit to change. The plane began its final approach into New York, the city skyline visible through the windows. David thought about how this flight, which had started with such tension, had transformed into something beautiful. A reminder that even our most uncomfortable moments can become opportunities for growth, understanding, and connection. As the plane touched down at New York's airport, no one rushed to grab their bags or phones like they usually would. Instead, there was a gentle quiet in the cabin, as if everyone was taking a moment to process everything they'd witnessed and learned during this extraordinary flight. The supervisor, who had been quiet for the latter part of the journey, approached David one last time as passengers began to stand. "Captain," she said, her voice clear and determined, "I've already spoken with our corporate office. They want to use your story in our company-wide training. What happened today? It needs to be shared." David nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the hardest lessons leave the deepest impact," he replied, gathering his belongings. "But make sure you tell the whole story, not just about what went wrong, but about how we all chose to make it right." As passengers began filing out, something unexpected happened. The young girl who had drawn the airplane picture stood up on her seat, much to her parents' surprise, and announced in her clear, innocent voice, Thank you for teaching us, Captain. Her words broke the spell of quiet, and suddenly the entire cabin erupted in applause. People began stopping at David's row as they left, each wanting to share a final thought or goodbye. The businessman handed David his card, mentioning plans for a diversity initiative at his company. The teacher asked about school visit possibilities. The elderly woman blessed him with tears in her eyes. Near the exit, the flight crew had lined up to say goodbye to passengers, as they always did. But this time was different. The flight attendant who had confronted David at the gate stood tall, looking each passenger in the eye, as if making a personal promise to do better. As David walked through the terminal, he could hear snippets of conversations from his fellow passengers sharing the story with others. You won't believe what I witnessed today. It changed how I think about. I'm going to tell my kids about this. At the baggage claim, the retired pilot who had been on the flight caught up with David. You know, he said, clapping David on the shoulder, in all my years of flying, I never thought a flight where I was just a passenger would teach me so much about being a better pilot and a better person. A week later, David received an email. The airline had started implementing new training programs based on what happened that day. They called it the Sky Has No Limits Initiative, focused on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. His story had already been shared with hundreds of employees. The flight attendant's brother had indeed applied to flight school. David kept his promise and became his mentor, guiding him through the challenges ahead. Your sister's honesty that day, David told him, opened doors for others to follow their dreams. The young girl's drawing now hangs framed in David's home office, next to his pilot's licenses and certificates. It reminds him that change often comes from unexpected moments, and that even difficult experiences can lead to beautiful transformations. 3 months after that flight, David was invited to speak at a national aviation conference about creating inclusive spaces in the airline industry. As he stood at the podium, he saw familiar faces in the audience: the supervisor, the flight attendant, and even some passengers from that memorable flight. He began his speech with words that had become his motto. The sky has no prejudice. It welcomes all who dare to soar. And down here on the ground, we should learn from its example. The story of that flight continues to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond that single journey from Atlanta to New York. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from textbooks or training manuals, but from moments when we choose to transform confrontation into conversation and prejudice into understanding.